Good afternoon, and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at misinterpreted.com. Wegner, born in 1886 in Elberfeld, Germany, he pursued study in Zürich, Breslau, and Berlin. Upon completing his doctoral studies in law, he joined the German armed forces. After a brief tour in Poland, he rose to the rank of second lieutenant in the German Sanitary Corps, which was attached to the Ottoman Sixth Army. He was stationed along the Baghdad Railway in Syria and Mesopotamia in the Ottoman Empire during World War I as a German soldier and medic. The photographs he took there were much misinterpreted, misrepresented, abused, and hijacked by the Armenian propagandists who used them as the core of witness images of the Turkish-Armenian conflict and 1915 events. In the years following World War I, Wegner opposed the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime. In 1933, he authored an impassioned plea to Hitler on behalf of German Jews. He was persecuted by the Nazi regime and fled after release from concentration camps. After leaving Germany in 1934, he lived the rest of his life in Italy. He was later recognized for his anti-genocide efforts, including recognition by Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations. He took hundreds of photographs in the Armenian resettlement camps in ez-Zor, which show that Armenian relocatees arrived at their destinations alive and lived in a reasonably organized camps, wartime conditions considered. There are no Wegner photographs that allegedly prove genocide that can withstand the scrutiny at a competent courtroom. None of the photos can serve as evidence, as claimed, of the extent of atrocities to which the Ottoman Armenians were subjected. They mostly show camps, people standing and staring at the camera, walking, carrying children or packs. In short, general scenes of a relocation. Muslims, mostly Turks, suffered through similar relocations and have worse photos showing people walking barefoot in the snow and slush of the Balkans and the Caucasus and Eastern Anatolia winters. But those photos are ignored out of sheer bias and bigotry of the Orientalist scholars. It is said that when Wegner's protest letter, published in a German newspaper, was shown to President Woodrow Wilson at Paris Peace Conference in 1919, Wilson made a case for the creation of an independent Armenian state. If true, there are several serious character deficiencies here. Number one, did Wegner's letter also mention Muslim, mostly Turkish, suffering and losses? If not, why not? My father was the sole survivor of the village of Kırlıkova. Greek, Bulgarian, and Armenian irregulars exterminated the entire population of the Turkish village, along with many other Turkish villages nearby. Hundreds of thousands of Turks were brutally murdered or forced to flee with just the clothes on their backs. That was in 1912. Similar tragedies occurred in Tsarist Russia using local Armenians, killed hundreds of thousands of Muslims, mostly Turks, but Circassians and others too, from 1914 to 1917. When betraying Armenians were being relocated in 1915 from Eastern Anatolia to Northern Syria, these Muslims were being driven from their homes in the Caucasus to Eastern Anatolia. Did Wegner take their photos? Did he at least mention Muslim suffering with a single line in that letter? If not, why not? 2. If Wilson were moved by the Wegner-letter to create an independent Armenia, then how can he morally reconcile his behavior with the fact that Armenians would constitute a tiny minority in those lands? That would be the first apartheid of the 20th century, where a tiny Christian minority, Armenians, would rule over an overwhelming majority of Muslims, mostly Turks. Is Wilson comfortable with apartheid idea? Whatever happened to the self-determination rights and the Wilson principle of equality? Is that principle dismissed if the practicing parties are Turks or other Muslims? Isn't that bias, bigotry, and Orientalism at its worst? What can be worse than such a blatant hypocrisy? In 1921, Wegner testified at the Kangaroo Court, trying Soghomon Tehlirian, the Ottoman Armenian terrorist who had assassinated Talat Pasha at point-blank range in broad daylight in Berlin. On one hand, Wegner is this pacifist who writes letters protesting violence and takes photos of atrocities, while on the other, Wegner sees nothing wrong with testifying in defense of a bloodthirsty Armenian terrorist. Although Tehlirian killed the former Talat Pasha, the former Ottoman administrator, in front of several eyewitnesses, he was found not guilty on the grounds of temporary insanity. Prosecutor was not given a proper chance or resources to cross-examine, produce witnesses, and build a strong case. Thus, Wegner's testimony helped excuse an Armenian terrorist for his hate crime. This is why I say there is blood on Wegner's hands. Wegner became an accomplice to a cold-blooded Armenian murderer. What kind of a heart-wrenching hypocrisy is that? Talat Pasha had been sentenced to death by yet another Kangaroo Court, the Ottoman Courts Martial of 1919-1920 in occupied Istanbul, where hearsay and even news clippings were admitted to evidence. Defense was not allowed proper legal representation or cross-examination of the claims of evidence. The occupiers, the British, were so embarrassed by these shenanigans that they decided to hold their own court in the island of Malta, where some 144 Ottoman leaders were later exiled. Please note that the British had controlled Istanbul for nearly 5 years, from 1918 to 1923, and had full access to the Ottoman files. If told tales by Henry Morgenthau, Lord Bryce, Arnold Toynbee, Johannes Lepsius, Armin Wegner, and other liars were so true, so factual, so irrefutable, then why did the Crown prosecutors reject to use those stories in the Blue Book or in Lepsius's writings or Wegner's photos? The answer is, none of the so-called evidence could withstand the scrutiny of a competent tribunal, and they knew it. They could only pass as truth in platforms where Turkish views, facts, archival evidence are censored, suppressed, and or ignored. The highest court in Europe proved this point beyond a shadow of doubt in 2015. When the Supreme Court judges of the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights heard the Turkish narrative supported by rock-solid documentation, they ruled that Armenian genocide was an opinion, not a court-proven fact. As such, rejecting that opinion is an exercise in freedom of speech. They added that Armenian genocide could not be compared to Jewish Holocaust, as the latter had a verdict by a competent court, Nuremberg, supporting it. What is the Armenian Nuremberg? By championing the plight of Armenians but ignoring the plight of Muslims, Wegner has shown the selective morality of a typical Orientalist. By grieving Armenian suffering and dismissing Turkish suffering, he displayed ethnic discrimination and religious bias. He should have found it in his heart to grieve for all human suffering without dividing the sufferers and the victims into camps based on religion, ethnicity, and/or nationality. If he did that, then I would respect him too. But right now, I simply cannot. I see Wegner as a bigot with blood on his hands for defending a cruel Armenian assassin. Wegner had never felt at home again in Germany after fleeing in 1934 and had lived out the remainder of his days in Italy. He had been virtually forgotten by the German people by the time of his death in Rome. I find the inscription on Wegner's gravestone most ironic. It says, and I quote, "I loved justice and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." No, Armin, perhaps it is divine retribution for your iniquity, your immoral and grossly unfair testimony at that Armenian terrorist Tehlirian's kangaroo court in Berlin in 1921, and your ethno-religious discrimination against suffering Muslims, mostly Turks, during 1915 when you were stationed in Ottoman Syria. Another integrity issue concerns the use of Armenian falsification in respect to Vereshchagin painting on Wegner's book cover. The second edition of the book, titled Der Prozess Talat Pasha, originally offered to the German reader by a certain Armin T. Wegner, was reprinted in Göttingen in Vienna in 1980 under the new title of Der Völkermord an den Armenien vor Gericht. The Vereshchagin painting appears on the very cover of this German book, Talat Pasha's photograph inserted in the upper left-hand corner. The German publication confidently announces in the inner pages that the cover photograph shows Turkish barbarism, supposedly depicting a pyramid of skulls in Western Armenia, 1916-1970. This is a blatant falsehood, as Vereshchagin painted this canvas in 1871 and called it the apotheosis of war, or the climax of war. It was meant as a art protesting Franco-Prussian War of 1870. It has absolutely nothing to do with Armenians. Yet, it is shamefully used by the Armenian lobby to vilify Turks. Feigel's caption partly reads, unquote, "Vicious propaganda comes in various forms. One of the most sinister is the hidden falsification. The pamphlet is adorned with a montage made up of a portrait of the accused, Talat Pasha, and a horrid mountain of skulls. Casual observers, and they are the majority, will inevitably make a connection between Talat and the crania on the cover," unquote. This dramatic shot was used to identify the genocide chapter in the Great War. The questions with this photo are, how do we know these people are Armenians? And why were these people hanged? Does a hanged people photo pass as a proof of genocide? Certainly, this image in itself is pretty disconcerting. I agree. It does not look like the civilized thing to do. However, the death penalty was in effect in the Ottoman Empire during 1915. Even Ottoman soldiers were executed for mistreatment of the Armenians. I do not support the death penalty personally, but some present-day civilized nations still practice this punishment, such as my own country, America. There were a lot of Armenians who were stirring things up, stabbing their nation in the back during a war of survival. Were the people in this photo hanged because they were simply innocent Armenians? victims of a systematic extermination, as the program would, PBS program would have you believe? Or were they traitors to their homeland that any nation of that period would have executed? PBS is known to be happy to broadcast one-sided Armenian television shows. There have been many through the years. One was called An Armenian Journey back in 1988. Naturally, since the real proof of the Armenian genocide is non-existent, these PBS shows repeat the same material over and over again, featuring the same Wegner photographs. The originals of Wegner photos are housed in Stuttgart's Schiller-Nationalmuseum, and ATAA, the Turkish-American organization, contacted the museum director regarding the Wegner photos. And the reply was, unfortunately, we do not have any indication regarding when or in what country the Wegner photographs were taken. As a result, the dating and sites depicted must be determined by whoever uses the photos, unquote. This response, unfortunately, though sincere, opens the door to Armenian propagandists who take liberty with the interpretation of Wegner's photos. That's why I call hijacking of the Wegner photos. Now, take a look at this photograph, also from the Great War, PBS. Has anyone documented to whom these skulls once belonged? Perhaps the most horrifying photo among all of Wegner photos is this one. We are not sure if Wegner even took this shot because it's so jarringly different than the others representing his work. Two other reasons why this photo is particularly fishy is, firstly, the Great War identifies Wegner as having visited a refugee camp filled with survivors. I do not know who was running this refugee camp, the Turks, the Christian relief organizations, or others. In any case, I would doubt that these skulls would be allowed to remain in the camp or nearby for Armin Wegner to have photographed it. It's very fishy. Secondly, since Armin Wegner happened to be encountering the resettling Armenians in 1915 and or in 1916, how did the flesh so cleanly melt away from these skulls in such a short time? A quick internet search shows that it might take several years in a desert climate where humidity is low and predators few. This is the point. We just don't know the origin of these photos. Even the legitimate Wegner work is undocumented, as the museum director plainly explained. Imagine what the source of all the horror photos the Armenians feature in their websites are. Here are two of the sadder images featured in the Great War. Children apparently dead due to starvation. What a heartbreaking sight. This one and the one next to it, again, we have no idea who the victims are. However, let us say that these children are Armenians, as they likely are. What do these photos prove, really? Surely the Armenians who were being resettled faced deplorable conditions, starvation being one of them. However, was this a case of the Ottoman Empire's deliberate campaign of murder, as the genocide advocates have attested? Even the Ottoman soldiers died of malnutrition. General Liman von Sanders, as an unfriendly witness in the trial of Talat Pasha's assassin, testified, the economic situation was so dismal that not only many Armenians, but thousands of Turkish soldiers as well died of the lack of food supplies, disease, and other consequences of poor organization in the Turkish government. In my division alone, after the Battle of Gallipoli, thousands died of malnutrition. Imagine, the Ottoman Empire is in its death throes, desperately fighting superior foes on multiple fronts. You would think if the limited resources would have to go anywhere, it would go to the one component that was keeping the nation from being run over, the military personnel. If the soldiers were dying of malnutrition and disease by the thousands, who in their right minds would fault the government for not feeding the Armenians as a priority? The Armenians who suffered from malnutrition were only one segment of the population who suffered from the same causes. Muslims suffered even more terribly. After all, the Armenians would soon have a flood of Christian charities organized by the Near East Relief Fund, to help them in this dark hour, to the tune of over $113 million, about $1 billion in today's currency. Not 1 cent of those would go towards starving Turks. The Turks would be totally on their own, facing even more desperate conditions as the war came to an end and their nation crumbled. Armenian relief camp. This photo, not one of Wegner's photos, depicts the tents put up by the Christian relief organizations. Note that, not that Armenians were having a wonderful time, but at least food and other needs were being provided for them, while the Turks continued to suffer. If the Ottoman government intended to do away with the Armenians, it would have slaughtered them on the spot, just like the Armenians massacred their fellow Turkish citizens and neighbors on the spot. Why bother with the resettlements? The word deportation is a misnomer, as it implies expulsion from a country, whereas the Armenians were taken from one place of the Ottoman Empire to another, within the same empire. Did Wegner prove a genocide or suffering? He did not witness a single massacre. By contrast, here's what his counterpart, a Russian medic, had to report. I quote, "I arrived in Bayburt on August 8, 1917. What I saw was terrifying. Armenians under the Russian administration were committing horrifying, wild atrocities against Turks in Bayburt and Ispir. The rebels named Arshak and Antranik slaughtered the children in the orphanage I worked at with their daggers. They raped young girls and women. They took away 150 children with them while they were withdrawing from Bayburt and killed most of them while they were still on the way." Unquote. Red Cross attendant Tatiana Karamelli, student of Russian medicine school, serving at Russian Red Cross 1917-1918, memoirs. Ottoman Archives, BOAHR SIS 2877-1. Massacred Turkish women and children in the village of Subatan. If Armin Wegner's photo serves as sufficient proof of genocide for you, then what does this photo suggest? There's a whole slew of photographs such as this. Moreover, many of these shots appear fully documented, unlike the images at the Armenian websites, the origin of which are mostly unknown. Will this information help the Armenophile scholars to ditch their bias and finally discover the other side of the story? Will it compel the Armenians to open their archives and accept the Turkish-American offer of civilized dialogue and reasoned discourse? Please join me next week to find out. Thank you and see you next week.